A very good morning, afternoon, or evening to you, wherever you might be, and a warm welcome to the third edition of our relatively new show, The Three Misses, abbreviated to the Three M's. The show where we peel back the layers of misunderstanding and misinterpretation that lead to misinformation. My name is Ian Ingalls, and I shall be your host. I'm glad to be joined, as usual, by my two fellow China expat experts, Jerry Gray and Fernando Munoz. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Hi.
So each show, I shall be picking the brains of this knowledgeable pair as we look at various topical but also ongoing news stories about China. In our previous shows, we discussed the US Congress's Uyghur Policy Act and China's much-rumoured social credit system. A little reminder to our viewers, and one that I do like to stress, that is that we three have all been living here in China collectively for about 65 years and have had so many different varied experiences of life and work up and down the country, which is something that many representatives of Western media outlets cannot claim to have had. Okay, now that that's all done, let's get to the discussion. So today we're looking at the big one. What is really going on with China's economy? Jerry, perhaps you could tell us in a word, is China going to collapse?
No.
Well, there you have it, folks. You heard it here first. Tune in next week for more China.
You asked for a word.
Oh, right. Okay, I was only joking. All right, then. What about you then, Fernando? Fernando, can you help us to understand this?
Sure, I can. There are several aspects to this. A recent interview that I saw with Professor Warwick Powell explained different aspects of this pending collapse. So let's talk about them as a whole, and then during the show, we'll talk about them individually. Number one is the Chinese economy, which is burdened by wasteful investment in unused infrastructure. This manifests itself as ghost cities, trains that are not profitable, or even some say saturation of infrastructure. So there's actually nothing left to invest in here in China. Another argument is the overcapacity of manufacturing, households that don't consume enough, and deflation on top of that. Furthermore, there's a property development industry that's collapsing on its own, and then the share market that has people pulling the money out in huge amounts. But that's not the last one. There's also youth unemployment that is raised also by the West as one of the issues, and also an aging population problem. Now, the thing that we need to understand that we want to present to you today and explain one by one is that each of these is a challenge. There's no doubt about that. Some are quite serious, but the truth is that none of them individually or even collectively represent a crisis.
You say they don't represent a crisis, and I take your word for it, but they do sound like, some fairly serious problems all the same. So before we look at them individually, Jerry, why would these problems or challenges that China is facing be such a concern to other countries?
That's actually a great question, Ian. And if I may, I'll refer back to Australia's ABC for part of the answer, at least. In a classic piece of misinformation, which is why we're here, or at the very least a misunderstanding, they put out an article last week, which we're going to link, and it had a fantastic headline, in my opinion, and it demonstrates what the real problem is. The headline said, China's economy is unraveling at a pace previously thought unimaginable. Where does that leave Australia? So I'm going to link the article in the description. So it's well worth having a read of that article to understand all of those points. And when, as Fernando just did, when you list them all out individually, wow, it does certainly sound serious. So, but the point is very well made as far as Australia is concerned, because China is without a shadow of a doubt Australia's largest trading partner, both imports and exports. So arguably, they've got most of their eggs in China's basket. Almost 30% of their entire economy is reliant on China, imports and exports. So if you take a look at that and then you say, well, how is China's trading position with the rest of the world? We take a look at the Asian markets, same situation. Many of them are China is their largest trading partner. ASEAN. China's the largest trading partner of ASEAN, and ASEAN is the largest trading partner of China. The European Union is also the same thing. And it recently took over from the USA because the USA as a trading partner is diminishing. There is no question about that. And that's one of the things that they're saying, well, this is a serious cause for concern. But what they're not saying is that Mexico's trading situation, which has massively improved with America, has equally as massively improved with China. So what's happening now is that Americans are paying middlemen who speak Spanish to get their goods for them. So if China does collapse, it's a serious problem, not for China. It would be a problem for China, of course, but for the rest of the world. It's a very dangerous situation. Janet Yellen, John Kerry, Gina Raimondo, Tony Blinken, they've all come to China. And they've all come really for one reason, because they don't want to see the collapse. They want to see China restrained, restricted, constrained, whatever the words are, but no one can afford a collapse of China. It was recently reported in the New York Times that 1.1 million jobs are directly involved with the Chinese trade. This is just in Australia. This is not America, Australia. There's only 26 million people there. So that's pretty big commitment. Luckily, it's not going to happen, because if it did, it would literally be the end of the economic world as we know it. So if China were to collapse, the domino effect, Asia, Australasia, Europe, USA, it would be devastating. There'd be soup kitchens. There would be no deliveries. There would be no car parts. There would be no equipment for mining. And if they were mining, there'd be nowhere to send their resources to. There would be mass unemployment, significant inflation, and a dramatic increase in global wealth. And that's why it's such a big concern to the world. So in theory, not a single country wants to see, not a single sane person wants to see China collapse.
Keyword is sane. Yeah. I mean, that really would be catastrophic, wouldn't it? I mean, if that were to happen, I mean, what you've just laid out there for us. But as you say, fortunately, it's not going to happen. Fernando, can you tell us why not?
All right, so let's take a look at all these factors individually. Let's talk first about the wasteful investment in unused infrastructure, right? China is building ghost cities, but it's actually forward planning. They definitely do exist, but only as ghost cities until people are ready to move in. I'll give you one example. When I first moved to Dongguan, there was an expressway that went all the way to a place called Songshan Lake. And I remember asking my friend, like, why you guys build such beautiful 8-lane freeway to nowhere? And they're like, well, that's going to be the future of the city. I'm like, I don't get it. This is 2001. Fast forward, that's where Huawei is. And all the different satellite factories and suppliers for Huawei are there. And it's one of the largest developments in the city. So that sense of vision is something that people don't see when they talk about these ghost cities. Now, one thing that the central government system is highly capable of doing, and is demonstrated again and again, it's planning ahead. Here's another example, this Yong'an. It's a new city that was announced in 2017. Now, it's a thriving metropolis, but for 3 or 4 years, it was a ghost town. The population at the beginning of this year reached 1.24 million people. If you think about it, there are only 10 cities in the US that have a population greater than that. But because it was China, it was laughed off as a ghost town just a few years ago. Now, let's move on to trains that aren't profitable. There are 42,000 kilometers of high-speed train lines in China, and these have brought incredible opportunities to local people. There may be some individual lines that aren't profitable, right? But overall, the economy has grown as a result of having them there in the first place. And that's the biggest difference between China and the West. In China, they build an unprofitable line to actually bring benefit to the people who live along that line. They don't really care about the profits for the people who actually build the line. It's about the people. So look at these individual lines and say, this is unprofitable. It's crazy. Why you do something like that? It makes no sense. It also is environmentally more friendly to have trains that run on electricity than to have diesel trains and planes. So there are many aspects to this that are not considered when you just say, this is unprofitable train system. Now, what about saturation of infrastructure? That has got to be a joke. The people who say this have never visited rural China. There's still a lot of work to do. There are now great roads, and I'm right now traveling on some of them. But apart from the train lines and the telecommunication with 5G into every single village and town in China, there's still room to grow. There's still room for massive improvements and infrastructure in rural China. And that's what China is going to be targeting now. You've all heard it. Rural revitalization. I just did a show in a small place talking exactly about that. What are these rural areas doing to bring huge investment? I did a report on the first village to reach 10 billion in assets and the dividends that were actually distributed to the local people. That's rural revitalization. It's something that people are not talking about yet. They're still talking about poverty alleviation, but China is 5 years ahead with this. So there's still room for massive investments in terms of infrastructure. So that's something that we don't need to worry about.
So China is a multi-ethnic state, but how many ethnic groups live in the People's Republic of China? Jerry, please fill us in.
Well, did you know, Ian, that there are 56 ethnicities living within the borders of China, and they have actually got 296 recognized different languages. Now, some people may argue that some of those languages are dialects, but I can cite academic reports that will say differently. These are different languages. So to suggest this, they're probably wrong, because the academics are usually quite right. The whole country has a complete harmony. This is what they aim for: harmonization within the country. And here's an interesting fact. Did you know that China, since 1949, has not had a race riot? That's the entire period of the People's Republic of China. There have been no race riots. There have been ethnic problems, but there's no race riots.
So I've heard in some recent reports, for example, I read one in the Atlantic Council and something that Reuters put out, of fears of what an overcapacity of Chinese manufacturing could have on other countries. And Fernando just touched on it earlier. So assuming there is an overcapacity in manufacturing, then what would that mean? Jerry, perhaps you can add to this?
Okay, there is not an overcapacity in manufacturing, Ian. China is the manufacturing center of the world. There's plenty of room for improvement still in manufacturing. There are currently between 400 and 800 million people who fit into what's called the middle class in China, and they are all consuming, buying, and improving their livelihoods. What China has done is it's moved much of the low-tech capacity outside of China and now imports them back. So this is another thing that has helped other countries to develop their economies at the same time. So where China is lifting people out of poverty, it's actually helping other countries to lift their people out of poverty as well. It's lifted the balance of trade because they're exporting back to China and helping those countries take care of China's overcapacity, which really didn't exist. China is still the world's largest exporter, but the most important thing is it's the world's largest consumer market as well. And it's diversifying manufacturing away to more technological automation and AI formats, which brings us to this question of households that save too much and don't consume enough. And that's what brings around deflation. And it's true, households could do something more that Westerners don't. One thing that they do is they save for the future. And it's a problem, but it isn't really a problem. It's a crisis according to the West, and it's a crisis according to Western bankers who want access to that money. But the idea of people borrowing from a bank is abhorrent. People not borrowing from a bank is even more abhorrent to Western capitalists. So this is the problem. People save here and they don't use the banking system to borrow from and pay interest to. And we get lots of stories in Western media about how bad it is. If you think about it, which would you prefer? A great home with all the trappings of modernity and a maxed out credit card, or a comfortable home that you pay nothing to live in with savings in the bank? And that's the difference between Chinese culture and Western culture in terms of their spending. Almost every home in China that I've ever been in, and certainly people I know, they have a washing machine, but very few will have a vacuum cleaner, for example, or a dishwasher, because these are things that we can do ourselves. We don't need these things. They're great devices, but they're not needed. And they're going to cost you thousands on a credit card if you don't have the money to buy them. So now we see why the economists get things very wrong, and why the capitalist media would very much like us to spend more money. And by the way, there are currently 56 trillion US dollars in Chinese savings banks. But here is a very interesting thing. If you take a look at this graph, the World Bank, China's not even number one. Japan and Korea have both got more. So if they're complaining about not enough consumption, probably they're complaining in the wrong places. But here's something we wouldn't expect. Even Bangladesh with 12 trillion and Algeria with 23 trillion US dollars have more money in savings than the USA. And the list is topped by, would you believe it, Iran. So you can go to the World Bank and check those statistics. Iran saves more than China, USA, Korea, and Japan combined. This is why BlackRock and companies like BlackRock would very much like to get their foot into the door of China. And this is what they're trying to do. I think BlackRock would be better off trying to make friends with Iran. So this huge amount of savings tells us something. And before I hand back to Fernando to talk about the property market crash, let me just say, Chinese people are not speculators. They don't, for the most part, invest in the stock market. There was a period of time about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, where the stock market first became kind of open, and a lot of Ma and Pa pensioners were going there and doing this. But they don't. Some of them lost their shirts. Most of them don't. They will put their money into savings accounts. We're seeing these stock markets because many foreign corporations, many foreign individuals are pulling their money out of China because the interest rates here are low and they're being kept artificially high in the West in order to encourage people to pull their money. The Financial Times reminds us very politely that Beijing is scrambling to keep the stock market afloat while over 25 billion in foreign shares are being pulled out. 75% of all foreign investments in Chinese stock markets have been pulled out of China. Now think about that. What is a stock? The only time a stock is good for a company is when it's launched as an IPO. When the IPO goes out, the company gets the money. The shares are now owned by people, and it's only those speculators who go up and go down. 90% of Chinese people are not those speculators. And that's why the stock market crashing around in China is not a real serious threat to the Chinese people. It's not a threat to Chinese businesses. The value of their company may go down. They've still got the money from the IPO if they've invested it wisely, and they've still got the assets that they bought when they went IPO. They've still got everything they need. And for the most part, the stock market in China doesn't affect most people. What does affect most people is the property market.
Wow, well, that is a fascinating and a highly comprehensive answer, Jerry. I suppose most people wouldn't have realized much of what you said above. And I assume
you have to know China.
Well, quite. Absolutely. And you can only do that by living here for a long time. So, I mean, I mean, I assume that, yeah, that would be true for most countries where the vast majority of the working people wouldn't own shares in companies, so the stock market price is of little consequence to them. So, as you just mentioned, then it's now time for Fernando to come on stage again. So, I'd like to tackle this last major question. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Fernando, that you are a homeowner in China and therefore would have a stake in the property market, right? So, as such, I'm guessing that you're fairly well versed in the property market. So, just as again, as Jerry alluded to, the Western media are often sort of harping on about how the property market is the Achilles heel of the Chinese economy, and its demise will mean the demise of the country, and what's more, it is inevitable. So, my question to you is this the one thing that is going to bring China down?
And the one word answer is not. It's not even going to affect China's GDP very much because it's not a crash, but a controlled landing. Several years ago, China said that homes are for living in and not for speculating on. They announced in 2019 that there will be changes to the structure of the property development market, and they let the entire world know about it. It is worth going back and reading China Daily's report about this particular issue from May 2019, where they indicated the new policies would stabilize the development of real estate. That article laid out all the problems, and it's linked in the description, as we always do, if anyone wants to read and learn for themselves. So remember that this was published almost 5 years ago. The vast majority of the industry knew what was coming and complied with these new rules. However, two very famous companies did not. Evergrande, which had listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 2009, and Country Garden, who has a very strange business model. Employees at project management levels, sales levels that are offered a 20% share in the profits, which is great, but if there's a failure, then they personally need to absorb 20% of the losses, which is not so great then. They're also one of the few companies in the world where the directors are required to invest their own personal income into the projects that they propose. Wikipedia has the information on this, and it's interesting to read if you want to spend some time on Wikipedia, which we don't do much around here. But anyway, for those of you who do. So what happened with these two organizations was that when China changed the investment and the banking laws to curtail their speculative buying methods, remember that if a salesperson couldn't sell a place, they had to buy it themselves in order to not lose income from the project. And this was driving massive surges in prices, as everything that was being sold before it was even part of any kind of plan. It was then resold again to speculative investors. And then finally, sometimes after several investors had owned it for a few months, it was possible for people who just wanted a home to live in to buy a property. But that was something the government wanted to stop. This was a cancer to the real estate industry. Both of these companies, which are quite large, in fact, Evergrande was the largest, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't think it would apply to them if they sought funding offshore. And this is why the West hates China's property crash so much, as it was Western speculative investors who lost most of the money. For the most part, as Jerry and I both know, the crash hurt people who own many apartments and had hoped to sell them at a profit, since the price was increasing at a rate between 5-15% sometimes every single month, because of their having scooped them all up and now having control. Evergrande couldn't build them fast enough, and billionaires couldn't buy them fast enough because they knew that a few $1 million invested every month would bring them a very positive return, until it stopped. Prices have indeed crashed, and normal moms and dads couldn't be happier. The market is now back to normal growth, and if you own your own place and you have no intention of selling, you've lost nothing. Basically, this doesn't affect you. You're living rent free. Now, if you wanted to get onto the property ladder and buy your first home or even a second home again, you're better off. Now, if you're a U.S. investor and you've got shares in the New York listed Evergrande, or you have invested into country gardens offshore debt bonds, then that's gonna hurt. You've speculated and you lost. China is now setting aside billions to buy up and finish up building some of those properties from these collapsed developments, and they will be released as low-cost housing. Furthermore, it is well worth reading the State Council's release of information from October last year. In it, there are a range of measures to help first home buyers and anyone who lost out in this controlled lending will get tax reliefs, tax refunds, lower interest rates, lower deposits. These are all the strategies for helping people to get a foot on the property market. I myself went ahead and bought my first home because it was the right time to do it. I'm glad that the property market went down because now I can live in a house even though I don't plan to speculate.
Hong Kong is an inalienable part of the People's Republic of China, and as such, all of its residents speak Mandarin Chinese. That's correct, isn't it, Fernando?
唔使講咩 Let me tell you, did you know? You're wrong. The official language of Hong Kong is not, as many people would believe, Chinese Mandarin. It is actually Cantonese and English. The number of Cantonese speakers in Hong Kong is 88%, and the number of native Mandarin speakers is only 2.3%. So it's an inalienable part of China, but they get to keep their own language. Now you know.
Very good. Well, there we have it. Not only is there no economic crisis, there isn't even a property crisis. Any last words, Jerry, on any other things that the West seems to think will bring China down?
Yeah, there's a couple more little things that are causing crises-like thoughts. And one of them is the increasing elderly population, the aging population. And that much is true. China has an aging population, but it's still lower than the USA and Japan in terms of percentages. So it isn't all doom and gloom. In fact, if I can refer our viewers to the same site Fernando did, there are 28 policies. We're going to link all of this stuff. There are 28 policies related to the aging population going back to 2012. They've known for a long time and they're prepared for this. The State Council information site. People can read whichever policy they find interesting or not at all, but just to know that it's there is good. And, I'd say anyone who's concerned about China's aging population, save your concern. Please don't worry. I'm personally, as I'm 65 years old now, I'm looking forward to aging in China. I'm actually even less concerned about youth unemployment. There are plenty of strategies, including loans for startups, loans for self-employed people, funds for cities to create incubators, many different opportunities going on. There are policies that have been announced and they're very visible on the State Council. Now, we've got the 2 sessions starting this week, and I think we're going to get even more policies for that. So that's going to be interesting. At the moment, you should really think about this. In June, when we had this kind of massive propaganda campaign about the youth unemployment in China reaching 20%, it didn't. It was 19.6%, but that's almost 20. 1 in 5 almost are unemployed, and that's something to be concerned about. But it's June. What happens in June? June 2003, the West forgets to mention June is graduation season. 8.3 million high school students, and listen to this, 10.7 million tertiary education students graduated in June last year. And that includes people finishing bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, vocational training. So we can see a surge is going to happen every June. Masses of people leave school, college, universities, and they go out into the marketplace. So it drops down, and it drops down every year. Around about September, October, it's back down China's overall unemployment rate is around 5%, and it's quite acceptable. It's well on target. They don't have a problem with it. I don't see why the Financial Times and other places really need to have a problem with it too.
So, as usual, much ado about nothing. No impending implosion of China's massive, vibrant, thriving economy that quite literally props up the world economy. At least, not quite yet. So thank you very much, both of you, for your observations. It has been another eye-opening and highly informative session. I look forward to our next discussion. And thank you out there for watching too. Feel free to comment, press the like button, share, and above all, subscribe to our channel. And we shall see you next time for some China insights on the 3Ms.
Just before we finish, Ian, can I just add one point? When people make a comment, please feel free. If you have a situation that you've heard of in China, send us the information. We'll look into it and we will correct the misinformation and give you the real information if it's a topic that's serious enough for us to take on as a challenge for this show. We're happy to take suggestions.
Very good point, Jerry.
Cool. All right, that's it for today. And remember, like, comment, share, and subscribe. And see you on the next show. Bye for now.
Bye for now.